What's up, football fans? Lindsay Rhodes and Sam Bruchhaus here, back from New Orleans. The season is in the rearview mirror. All 32 have now officially hit the offseason. We've got a lot to talk about on the Sumer Sports Show. Sammy B, should we start with the game? Put a button on all of this. I feel like the headline here is WTF.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm really shocked by, Lindsay, is the fact that you hit the nail on the head about the halftime show. I was sending recommendations, sending 4-hour YouTube links to you and deep research, and you just drilled it. I mean, like a lot of GNX coming from Kendrick Lamar, some excellent dancing, a Serena Williams, hometown show up. It was great to watch, but you really nailed the setup, the lineup.
Yeah, I loved all of the layers. I loved all of the, like, if you were paying attention, the things that you kind of like, the Easter eggs that were in the performance. I thought it was artistic. I thought it was fun. I had a great time. I loved it. I thought it was very fun. I also thought that the conflicting reaction to it on various social media platforms was highly interesting to me. Told the story within itself. But yeah, I'm a nerd about the about the halftime show. Every single year, I do a deep dive, regardless of who's performing, and it's like I do research for like a month, and I just like listen to the music in the car, so that then when it comes time for the halftime show, I feel all of the investment and can enjoy it to the max. My kids and I do like a thing where I play like little snippets of the beginning of a bunch of different songs that I think might be the first song, and we all play guess the first song. Like this is what it's like in the Rhodes household in the build up to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, and Kendrick just let it fly with the unreleased song, just off rip, which I guess makes sense for him, given like he's a Pulitzer Prize winning artist and kind of the pinnacle that we know of that level of art and performance art as well. But I wouldn't have guessed an unreleased song to start, but it was great. And I mean, that's kind of how he starts out his albums anyway. I particularly loved the SZA part, which I know you were big on. You called all the stars being in the set list.
I thought you brought up a really good point, though. Sam said to me, like that was from a Disney movie. Does Disney own the rights to the song? Is Disney going to want to be like, this feels like it has the potential to be kind of like a performance that's right on the edge, in terms of a lot of like political stuff. And so is Disney going to want to lend their song to that? I thought that was a really good point. That was the only reason that I was like, is it going to be in the show? But then, yeah, it made sense, obviously.
Yeah, and it really did tilt towards the like revolutionary in tone and in, again, like the performance art. Obviously, Samuel L. Jackson was the main event of the more revolutionary stuff. So it was great to have him in it also, because it's like a full circle moment. His most famous movie is based in LA. So there was just like it was pretty much just celebration of like LA, Serena from Compton, SZA on TD, like just great music. I was a big fan. I wish in retrospect I would have gone to like a little larger, bar type party, because I think it would have been way more fun to listen to it where people were like dancing, especially given they mixed it for like a venue like that. Like I was just watching in a living room eating pizza, and it was like mixed extremely clear. And so it didn't really reverberate the same way that it would when you're like actually trying to listen to the music and there's like a bunch of stuff going on. Like didn't exactly hit the same in a totally quiet living room, everyone locked in.
I was just going to say, yeah. And it also depends on who you were watching with. Like if you were watching with
Very
people who
so.
were like, who are these people and what are they saying? Then like tonally that kind of affects the level of ability to lean in and just fully enjoy it. Yeah, I would imagine that this was the height of halftime shows that would give you very different experiences watching it based on who you were watching it with.
Yeah, it was excellent. I think as someone who loves GNX, I really love that all the songs are in there. Certainly.
Yeah. Big fan as well. This was also, I think it's like a perfect microcosm of, to me, it's like a just lean into life experiences, like it like you could tell a lot of different people in terms of the way that they just approach life in general based on how they wanted to just outwardly react to this. Like a lot of, I personally am not somebody who leans into just in general dismissing anything off the cuff. Like I'm like, it's not my thing, but like I get that a lot of people like it. It's more of a me thing. And this felt like one of those situations where it feels like if you just kind of like open your mind and go, a lot of people like this. Why do they like this? And get curious about the performance, then you're probably more likely to actually enjoy it because you understand a little bit more of the intention behind it. And at the very least, whether you're into rap or not, you can kind of go, oh, I get what he was doing there. I get the message there.
Right.
I get, all the different things, like when people are screaming and I watched it back last night again, and the entire crowd screaming A minor. I'm like, there's so many layers to the performance, to the songs, that I think even if you're not into hip hop or rap, like you can kind of go, okay, I get what happened here. And that's kind of cool that they were able to put that together.
Yeah. The thing it reminded me of was when they put Dave Chappelle on SNL right after an election, and it's like definitely reactionary.
Right.
But obviously this was substantially less reactionary, but like it's designed to get people on both sides talking. And then you watch it back over and over and over again. You catch like the little things that are artistic decisions. And you're like, oh, I see why you did that. Oh, I see why you did that. And it seemed like, number one, like the memeability of the moment, like going around the circle with the big cheesy Cheshire Cat grin on his face before he,
at that point I was like, this feels like an SNL skit that's waiting to happen, right?
Yeah.
Like they can recreate this in a lot of different ways.
Before he says, radical things on television in front of 176 people about the biggest star of the last 25 years. Like it's a pretty big moment. They clearly set it up for that to be like memed. And then like there's also like the more general commentary on the Black experience in America, which is being done as well. But it felt as if it was like definitely created to be rewatched, which I definitely appreciate because I've already rewatched it like 5 times.
Totally. If anybody is just tuning in for football, knows Sam as like a hardcore like Sumer football data scientist, all the X's and O's, all that kind of stuff. What you guys don't know is that he is perhaps more passionate about music and also, as I learned, food, because this guy was our tour guide in New Orleans and did not steer us wrong in terms of where we should go eat. The entire week we ate so well because you knew all the right spots that were necessarily like, doesn't mean that, we're going to all the like hot spots. We're going to the right spots where you're going to get a taste of New Orleans and a bunch of different flavors. And we were at a dinner once. We were at dinner this past week and we leave and he goes, oh, who is that? I see this, this person's getting into a G-Wagon. And he goes, I know who that is. Who is that? And he's like racking his brain. And then he goes, Trombone Shorty. And I'm like, who the F is Trombone Shorty? And why did you just recognize the and of course, now we all know America the Beautiful. And that's another way where I felt like I'm like, tell me more about Trombone Shorty. And then I'm telling everyone at my party about Trombone Shorty like a week later. I'm like, oh, this guy here, let me tell you all about him. But if you need a New Orleans tour guide, I cannot recommend Sammy B the most.
Yeah, I got to give Shorty a shout out. My boy had the, candy coated G-Wagon that my man was rolling out an old school Crescent City Steaks. Big shout out to his car. Big shout out to him on the broadcast. Car. Like, I mean, hey, it was a nice car. And I recognized him in the restaurant, but it was like hopping in the G-Wagon, ripping back home at 8 p.m. was the one that I picked up on. I also love the music to begin with. So Lindsay, like when you go to the parades, the Mardi Gras parades, there's a ton of bands that come through and typically like they're more in the line of like the HBCU style bands. And like, there's a particular way that they play, which is great for parades because they're so loud. And Southern's band is like a whole nother level. Like you can hear them a mile away. People start running towards the street. They play everything from, the latest songs. Like I know they played Sticky by Tyler, the Creator very recently, but my favorite that they play is Everyone Wants to Rule the World by Tears for Fears. Because for some reason they have a composition of that song that is a level of loud that is like breaks the brain and like shatters the ribs. Like it is so loud. You can hear it from like 2 miles away on the parade. So it was awesome to see them, the Human Jukebox from Southern University, one of my favorite bands. It's just all kinds of good stuff, good to reconnect with the New Orleans vibes for me, for sure.
And then, by the way, speaking of New Orleans vibes, that whole pregame show that the NFL put on, I assume that's NFL that gets credit for it. Like the on the
Right.
field stuff, building up to the game, the New Orleans flavor that was incorporated. Like the attention to detail, like the gates, where the team walked out. Like little
Right.
things like that. I thought that they nailed the pregame show in ways that I don't recall in years past. Like usually it just kind of feels like a pregame show, right? Like, and then here's the next song and it's like there's pageantry and it's big,
Right.
but this one felt like it had a very specific flavor that nailed the city. But that might be specifically because New Orleans is such a distinct flavor that's
Yeah.
easy to represent in that way. Like, how do you do that for LA? That was the one thing that I kept saying all week. In New Orleans, like the architecture, the food, everything feels like it has a specific culture behind it. And I was like, I love LA. I'm from LA. But I'm like, what's the culture of LA? Like, what would that be if it was food and we're trying to establish like the food, the food of LA? I mean, or like, the architecture of LA. There is no specific culture that you get, when you're telling the story of LA, I guess, in a way that New Orleans is so specific and distinct, and easy to recreate maybe in that environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think they did an okay job last time. Like I know in my head, which I like did a deep dive into this the other day, and I think The Rock is just associated with Miami, A, because he went to the University of Miami, and B,
Right.
because of the show Ballers, which is like not
Oh,
a
for sure.
real
Yes.
a real indication of The Rock at all. But like I remember they brought The Rock out. They had, they had the Death Row halftime show last time, which was pretty cool. And then like I know the Clippers have done stuff with more like Chicano culture and stuff like that. So I mean, there's always a good mix to have. I'm really interested to see what's going to happen next year because it's like San Francisco, but I mean, Candlestick was in San Francisco. Now it's in Santa Clara, which is more like Bay Area. Like, is it going to be like super techie? Is it going to be like Grateful Dead vibes? Like, where are we going? Like and then like there was a bunch of mentions, which also sidebar, Robert Mays had one of the like a top 10 Twitter posts that I've ever seen of him in like a Caribbean restaurant with just 7,000 calories of food. And it like separately went viral from the from the football community. Just excellent. But like people were saying it all week. It's like New Orleans, because of its geographic like size, which is not very big, and just the fact that the Superdome was built in the 70s when it was like, okay, wait, this actually has to be in the middle of the city. And they've just been able to update it because of the way it was built, is a definite, checkbox for an event like the Super Bowl in a way that the new stadiums, which are typically built more to be like the linchpin of new communities far away from the city center, are just not like optimized for. I mean, MetLife is an hour and a half away from Manhattan, for example. And so it's just difficult to recreate the historic nature of the city in a very small geographic footprint that is easy for 100,000 to 200,000 fans, media, and athletes to navigate.
Yeah. I mean, you definitely can't get that in a city like LA, Santa Clara, like you mentioned.
Houston as well, who was hosted it recently as well. Atlanta.
So let's get to the game.
Right.
And I mean, I could not have just anticipated this game more incorrectly. Like I just didn't see it going this way, which is not to say that I didn't think that the Eagles that roster is insane, right? But I think we can talk about the Eagles and what they did, and we should probably start there. The thing that I walked away with more was like how confusing the Chiefs were this season. My highest level thought to come out of the Super Bowl is like we spent the entire season being kind of confused about how to articulate why the Chiefs were good. This was the whole conversation the week of the game for me. Was I felt like I can absolutely tangibly put my finger on why the Eagles are good. And I can explain that so well, right? Like the roster is incredible. They perform in all the advanced metrics. All of it tells a story that's reflective of what we see on the field. The Chiefs, not so much. The Chiefs were like, if you're looking at EPA rankings for the majority of the season, you're like, they're in like the 9 to 15 range in almost everything, right? Like it felt like that's where they lived this season. They're not bad in anything, but they also weren't elite in anything else. And so we spent the whole week in the build up to the game talking about how to explain the Chiefs and the dichotomy of the two teams in that sense. In that, on the one hand, you have one that's very tangibly easy to assess, and the other one who's clearly good, but it's harder to put your finger on why or how. And then in retrospect, I wonder if we just need to go back and reevaluate all of the allowances that were given to the Chiefs. And if maybe we overthought it to a degree going into the game and saying like, yeah, but the Chiefs are going to win because they find ways to win, even though we couldn't figure out a way to tell that story in a way that felt like it was supported by the numbers. At the end of the day, now that's my biggest thing that I'll walk away with going like, maybe I shouldn't make those allowances. Maybe I should kind of lean into the data that's in front of me and the things that are tangible in terms of making assessments.
Yeah, I think the toughest element to analyze is that the Eagles' path to victory was straightforward prior to the game, and it was that they were going to get up early and the Chiefs were never going to be able to come back. The issue is the expectation was going to be that they were going to be able to break long runs behind their offensive line, which they were not able to do all game. They basically shut Saquon Barkley down the entire game.
Yeah.
And moreover, that Jalen Hurts was going to have an excellent game. And I think Jalen Hurts's play certainly closed the door. But, I mean, the pick was really, really bad. He had several missed throws while the game was still tight that kind of kept the Chiefs in it. And then down the line, he was able to make big plays, particularly with his feet and the big throw to Devontae Smith that kind of closed the door. What the real happening and occurrence was, as you noted, of like maybe we should have just believed the data, which is hilarious. Like, you know, me and you are so data oriented.
I know.
Especially on Super Sports, and we're like not believing the data. And you know, going all the way down from our machine learning engineers all the way to Sean, who is like a film guy, everyone was in agreement. Like you have to have some allowances. But the defense of the Eagles just shut Mahomes down. And the question is like, is that a continuation of, you know, the quote unquote decline, even though the decline is very minimal, of Mahomes that we've seen over the past 2 years? Or is it a side effect of the offensive line not playing very well, the tackles getting smoked all game, having to throw to Juju Smith-Schuster and DeAndre Hopkins? Like, what is this a side effect of? And I don't think we really have any answers, primarily because they played pretty well against the Texans and the Bills, and the Eagles were just a better team when it came down to it.
Well, I wonder again if, you know, and this is an admittedly hindsight conversation. Like I'm trying to check our work now, right? And I wonder if all the stuff that happened in the season that felt very arbitrary in terms of the way to describe the Chiefs. So it was like what I kept saying all week when I was picking the Chiefs was that all season long, we've been talking about the teams who are popping in terms of data. And you're like, the Eagles, this, and the Bills, this, and the Lions, this, and the Vikings, this. And then you go, and I said it all year long. And then the Chiefs are going to win the Super Bowl anyway, because of course, like just as an aside at the end, like it almost as a joke, like a punchline. And there's all this data that supports all these teams being so good. And then, but the Chiefs are going to win it anyway. And then because they were there, I was like, well, there has to be some there, right? Like the fact that all season long, they were able to get away with it without us being able to point to a data point that was specific. And I got kind of okey doked by that. But I wonder if, again, maybe even their path to the Super Bowl wasn't one that we could have examined more closely. Like the Texans were an offense that maybe wasn't one that they weren't a team that felt like a very strong playoff team to me. So the fact that they got through them, you know, take it for what it's worth. And then the fact that they played the Bills, and the Bills were a great team, but their defense wasn't that great. So if the issue for the Chiefs that we've identified here, particularly on the offensive line, the fact that their tackle play was bad, and they didn't have a matchup in the Bills that could really exploit that, because that's not where their strength was. So maybe we still should have been asking the questions. Maybe we should have been a little bit more curious about trying to explain why they weren't popping in the data, and like whether or not that actually was going to matter in a game like this, as opposed to just putting our finger on the fact that they found ways to win. Because in no way did I look past the Eagles, not in any way. Like, I saw the Eagles for all of the things that they were. I think that the thing that was confusing for me in terms of trying to predict the Super Bowl was the fact that the Chiefs always did just enough. And how do we evaluate that? How important is that? What kind of a skill set is that? Even though it didn't make sense to me because they were in all these one-score games. And so people who are just saying, well, they know how to pace themselves. They've been to the postseason before. That experience is valuable. I think that that's true to a degree, but that also never made sense when you're talking about the way that their season played out. Because at some point, when you're in a close game, you better stop pacing yourself. You better put your pedal to the metal and figure it out, find a way to win this game. And just enough is going to bite you in the butt. So in retrospect, them almost like purposefully doing just enough makes no sense at all with the way that their season went.
There's two bits of data that I think stand out. And I think an off-season long investigation into Patrick Mahomes is necessary. And like you said, maybe this is just a result of the Eagles defense. But our sack avoidance stat is typically pretty sticky. And this is an advanced artificial intelligence metric that scores how well players are avoiding sacks. And it's not just grading, how guys are spinning out of sacks or running away from sacks. Like Matt Stafford is a good kind of example of a guy who has good sack avoidance plays kind of pre-snap. Patrick Mahomes pretty much every year has been in the near the top 10, except for this year. And that feels like something. Like most years he's in the top 5, like a 90th percentile blue grade guy when it comes down to sack avoidance. And last year, still in the 70th percentile, top 10, very elite still. And this year it just cratered. He's had all kinds of different offensive lines. Why do you think that drops so heavily, Lindsay? Do you think there is a change in something that's going on? Perhaps like the offensive coordinator. I know that became a standpoint of like maybe Matt Nagy and like the changes coming off of Bieniemy, like being a little bit more in charge, but Andy Reid's still the head honcho there. What do you think is like really the change there? And should we take stock in that 1-year drop?
I don't know. I feel like I need more information to find out because oftentimes when somebody craters in a stat, that's an indication of something. Either they're playing hurt, like go evaluate it more, ask more questions, or sometimes what we're looking for in our world is signs that maybe the person has kind of like reached the tipping point, and they're on the downslope of their career. It doesn't make sense to me that any of that is the story with Patrick Mahomes. So if you just took the sack avoidance, and I think your point is well made, it doesn't necessarily have to do with taking sacks. It's your ability specifically to evade pressure. It's your ability to get out of the sack when that's a possibility. So it's not necessarily, sack avoidance isn't necessarily reflective of like, oh, you were sacked a lot. Well, tackles, not good. There's more to it than that. The fact that he fell as far as he did in all of the other metrics that we track with tracking data was my big, like, I thought it was a red flag for the metric and like a way that we needed to go back in and reevaluate a few things and tweak them. But now I'm wondering if there is some other story that's being told. And I think there's no doubt that you and I both think that Patrick Mahomes is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. So to take even numbers that are down in a year like this, I think it's important to have the context of that. Like he's certainly done enough to have benefit of the doubt, but there is no way around it. His year was not a good year for him. Like, because it's not just sack avoidance, which by the way ranked 27th out of 46 quarterbacks, but it's the accuracy. Like accuracy was 26th ranked. Timing was 19th. Like he wasn't in the top 15 in a single metric that I'm looking at right here. Not even a single one. And we all know that Patrick Mahomes is a top 15 quarterback. So then that takes you to like what are we doing? Like what happened this year? And I don't think he was hurt. There was no commentary about him being hurt. We know that the offense was different. We know that, like, in terms of EPA stats, but by the way, he was 9th in EPA per dropback. How is he 9th in EPA per dropback when the story of EPA a lot of times is ability to pick up chunk yards, right?
Right.
Like expected points. So the fact that he had almost no explosives this year, he's not throwing the ball downfield. It's very dink and dunk, and he did that successfully. Like, the success rate of the offense, I would say, is its calling card, but it's very dink, pick up yards after the catch, dink, pick up yards after the catch. So I could see all of that impacting him. But when you're tracking things like accuracy, like, how is that off? How is that off for Patrick Mahomes?
Right. And I think this game in particular was the turning point of these discussions, because excuse number one years ago was, well, they're playing too high and they're playing basically to stop Patrick Mahomes and only Patrick Mahomes.
Yep.
And Vic Fangio was the guy who did that. 0% blitz rate, guys all over the field dropping back. You get a pick from Zach Bond. You get a pick from Cooper DeJean. Like, these are all guys designed to stop Patrick Mahomes. And then the second part, the second excuse, is that he doesn't have any great wide receivers and the offensive line isn't that great. And that showed up again, like the sacks, the pressure, both from the inside and from the outside. It was all there. We had wide receivers who were struggling to get open. And then the final piece, which is like, what is actually happening here? It felt like he pulled the string on so many passes in this game where it was inaccurate or behind someone or the timing was not correct. And you saw the frustration on Kelsey's face kind of throughout the entire game. They just weren't able to hook up. They cleaned it up a little bit at the end when they're down 30, but it was really a culmination of, it was like when you are reading a book and you're going in the rising action. And it's like, okay, now everything's clear to me. How is this going to continue on? The problem is he still beat Josh Allen with big time crunch plays, and they were able to outscore the Bills, and they still beat the Texans, and they still beat pretty much every other team they played this year. So it's like, how much does this actually matter? But it is an interesting investigation to have.
Yeah. And by the way, for anybody who's listening, the reason that I think that we are focusing more on the Chiefs in this game than the Eagles, who deserve and are getting lots of attention everywhere. There are lots of things that we could discuss, but it feels like because the thing we don't understand is the Chiefs.
Right.
And I think that that's kind of what we do here at Sumer, is try and figure out the answers or pose questions to things that are a little bit more complicated. Like, we want to be able to be predictive. We want to be able to, build the right rosters. Like in the Eagles case, it's pretty obvious that they just had, like, top to bottom, an insane roster. And that's less fun to talk about because there's less questions to be answered. It feels more straightforward and obvious what they did and how they did it. Although obviously there are people there that should be celebrated in all the different ways.
Right.
The thing that's more interesting to me is somebody that wants to be able to nail the predictions of who's going to be good before anyone else knows that they're good. That kind of stuff is to answer these questions that clearly crept by us. And I think that the Chiefs are a perfect example of just a really, really perplexing team in so many ways. And Patrick Mahomes, I think, has emerged from this game as almost like the poster child of that.
Right.
In so many ways, I'm just confused by him. I do think, and I hate legacy conversations around the Super Bowl, I do think that this is actually... But I do think that this performance in the Super Bowl for Patrick Mahomes will end up being more than one game. Like, in terms of narratives and those kinds of gross conversations that people want to have, I think that we're still going to be pointing to this game, 7 years down the road. Because if he does, and I assume he will, but maybe we're wrong, I think that he's going to end up at the end of his career, and he's not now. But at the end of his career, there's going to be a conversation about Patrick Mahomes and Tom Brady and the GOAT. And the fact that he's gone to 7 straight AFC championship games is like, what, like the fact that he puts his team in a position consistently to be in the Super Bowl is, at the very least, if that continues, going to make that a really interesting conversation. But the fact that he played so poorly on the biggest stage is going to be something that enters that debate. We're going to go back to that a lot not we, but people who have the LeBron MJ type conversations when we're doing Mahomes and Brady, the fact that he went to the big game and then was at the very least a big part of the reason that his team lost. That's not something that we ever saw from Tom Brady. And so if he doesn't match him ring for ring and or win more, I think that that's going to end up being the deciding factor.
Yeah, and I think the fact that he's gone up and beaten these Avengers style teams before. I mean, the San Francisco 49ers last year had as good, if not a better roster than the Eagles this year. I know their defense was a little shakier, as they did with, Jimmy Garoppolo years ago. Even though Jimmy Garoppolo was the core weakness of that team, they were still an excellent team. And the fact that he wasn't able to do it again is interesting. You mentioned it, like, it's uninteresting in quotes for the Eagles because the Eagles just went out and executed. I mean,
Yeah.
we pretty much nailed what they were going to do, other than, of course, the running game popping off big plays. They got the ball to A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, executed that. And on defense, they played it pretty vanilla, let their talent win, and their talent won play after play. And so when you're able to execute like that, you typically will win games if there is not an X factor on the other team, which Patrick Mahomes was not that X factor in this game.
Is the takeaway from this game in terms of roster building, go get yourself a really, really strong defensive line? Like, if you're the Bills, if you're a team that's in the AFC that can't get over that Chiefs hump and you keep running into the wall that is Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes, is the answer less to build up your offense and go shot for shot against them and more to do what the Eagles like to build it? I mean, it's so much easier said than done. Like, go build a defense like the Eagles. What?
Right.
But particularly up front, but it can't be understated what they did on the back end too, from a coverage standpoint. So like, yeah, they're getting home with 4, but it's also helpful that the coverage is good, and that they just got in Travis Kelce's way the whole game. I wonder what the takeaway is here if you're a team that's trying to get past the Chiefs that can't.
I think if you're trying to glean any like major long-term takeaway, it's just to build through the trenches. Like, it's typically going to be a more stable environment when you have big guys that are very good in a game that is based around big guys that are very good.
Mm-hmm.
Because you think of the DBs for the Eagles, and it's a lot more, dice shots and duct tape and practice squad guys. Like, Zach Bond went from a practice squad guy to the number one linebacker. No one disagrees.
Yep.
Like, could have been the defensive player of the year this year in 8 weeks, 6 weeks.
That's
like, it was just
wild.
kind of a miracle. And then Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean were near Pro Bowl guys, and they were rookies. And then you have Reed Blankenship and CJ Gardner-Johnson. I'm not betting on them being good again. And Darius Slay was a crapshoot all year. I'm not betting on him being good again. So I could just as easily see that portion falling apart. But like you said, I can't see the defensive line falling apart, though there are some free agents going in and out. And I can definitely not see the offensive line falling apart unless injuries decimate all 5 guys.
I mean, the obvious thing here is, too, that the Chiefs are going to have to address the tackle situation this offseason. And the chances that we're looking at a similar Chiefs roster next year feels slim to none. Like, that's the most obvious thing that they have to do this offseason is shore up those tackles. How do you think that they go about doing that in terms of free agency draft?
Typically, the tackle position has to be through the draft, and they tried to address it with Kingsley Suamataia from BYU this year, who was a definite project and didn't turn out to be a solution. I think to the flip side, I am like of the hot taker side that I think they should just let Trey Smith go. I think you can replace 70 to 80% of his production with a guy off free agency for much cheaper. It seems like Trey Smith is going to be the most highly paid interior offensive lineman in the league next year. It wouldn't make exact sense to let him go from like a chemistry perspective, I suppose. But I think that if you're really trying to devote money to the tackle position, that's where you're going to find the money by not paying $5 to $10 million extra dollars on a guard. Separately, I think that's the move for them. I think their defensive line is probably fine. And like their defense is more confusing because I thought they were good all year, and I just think they have good players. Like I think Karlaftis is a fine player. I thought Nick Bolton played decently in this game. I think Trent McDuffie's an All-Pro. Justin Reed's a good
on the tackles. That was
right.
That was the one thing that might have been pointing out to people all this week.
Yeah, and then they were an excellent tackling team all year, which is like something that you definitely want to look at if you're trying to figure out how to rebuild a defense. So I think really the offensive line and the wide receiver positions are the place where they have to rebuild.
In terms of getting a tackle through the draft, it's sitting at 31. Is there any chance they have to move up to go get that guy? Like, they're not a team that typically is a move up in the draft type of team. Usually the teams that are picking at the bottom have the luxury of having really deep rosters, and so they don't have to make desperation moves. But since the position that they so clearly need, and they need two of them potentially, I wonder if they don't have to get creative this year to go make a move to get somebody. Because there's only talking to people, who are O-line experts looking at the different guys in this year's class, people have said these 4 guys are guaranteed to be tackles this year, and then there's always the tackle turns to guard in the NFL. And so if we're essentially looking at 4 guys in this entire class that are like legit, you're going to be a tackle in the NFL, then if I'm looking at the Kansas City Chiefs sitting at 31, I'm not entirely sure that they're getting the guys that they need in that spot.
Just looking at the consensus big board, there's 2 guys I like in that range who are probably tackles, which is Ariante Ursary, who we've talked about many times on this show, and then Josh Connerly, who was like the player of the week across the offensive line at the Senior Bowl. I think those 2 guys will be in range. It is interesting that last year they had the same exact problem and they went ahead and took Xavier Worthy. I think that'll probably flip this year, but
I mean, it literally
they
cost
still
them
have the same exact problem. Yeah. And then all this to be considered, Rashee Rice is coming back, and Rashee Rice through 2-3 weeks was one of the best wide receivers in the league. So
yeah, it's
like we forget about that piece, which is interesting.
I do think it creates an interesting offseason storyline because, like the Eagles at 32, I mean, I couldn't even begin to start telling you what direction that they would go in there, because I think that that's how they've built this team, is the luxury of like, we have so much depth and we're not desperate. And by the way, whatever they have lined up to lose in free agency, and we can go over that, they will have a free agency period prior to the draft. I think that they position themselves consistently to just take the best available when that person falls to them. And they've afforded themselves the luxury of being able to take shots on guys like Jalen Carter when they start to fall. Go, we can do that. These other teams that cannot metabolize the risk that comes with some of these draft players, and it happens every year where somebody's really, really talented, but for whatever reason, you're like, oh, there's some stuff here where it might miss for reasons that have nothing to do with his talent, and a team that is as deep as the Eagles can raise their hand and say,
right,
I mean, if it misses here, then like we're still probably okay. Like I'm not losing my job, and I can now go out and grab this incredibly talented person and plug him in. And I think that it's such a luxury to be picking in that range. I'm kind of fascinated by the fact that the Chiefs have this massive problem at this position that is, because I think what you brought up, that you want to get a tackle through the draft. I think that's the next layer to this, is there are certain positions that you're fine picking up in free agency, because like a guard, for instance, go pay the best guard in free agency because the price point is still not that high. Whereas like a tackle, an edge rusher, obviously a quarterback, wide receiver, these are the guys that you want the guys that are going to be high end guys because they're so expensive. So if you could get them on a rookie deal for 5 years, that's how you want to build out your team. I think that the Chiefs now are presented with a very interesting offseason situation in that they are where they are. And I think that they are going to be operating with a certain degree of desperation that we normally see teams in that range operating with.
I think it's interesting if you're looking forward to next year, classifying teams as you did of who is going to be drafting the best player available and who is going to be drafting for need. It seems like the Lions, the Ravens, and the Eagles, and maybe the 49ers, but probably not, depending on how their defensive backfield works out, can draft for, just whoever the best player is. The Rams kind of are in this position too, ironically.
That's crazy.
Where they can just kind of draft whoever. However, the Vikings, the Chiefs, and a couple other teams, the Bills also to a certain degree, particularly on that defense, will have to draft for need for how they fill in positions because they just are not good at certain positions. And that's what's holding them back right now. Now, it's very different for the Chiefs versus the Vikings because the Vikings have loaded positions at the positions where you have to nail in the draft. The Vikings have 2 certified tackles and 3 certified wide receivers. The Kansas City Chiefs have 0 certified tackles and 0 certified wide receivers, or 1 if we're counting Rashee Rice, who's coming off of a, catastrophic injury. So it's interesting to compare those, especially when we're kind of ranking teams for next year.
Just to follow up real quick, what do you think those obvious things are for the Vikings?
I think they have to get better across the defensive backfield. You're playing Cam Bynum was good. Harrison Smith is old, and then everyone's going to argue about cornerbacks in the Flores system and how they're uniquely seated to lose or the things that they have to do. But you can't cut it with Stephon Gilmore, who's 35 or something like that, and Byron Murphy, who was the most targeted player in the league this year.
What about the Bills?
Same difference. The reason the Bills are not the Super Bowl champion right now is because their defense was not good. I think they're fine at the edge position. They had all year, they had a linebacker plus. And I think Milano was not great when he played. I thought they should have just played Dorian Williams the entire time, even though I'm biased there, of course. He was one of my best friends. But and then the defensive backfield was not good, and Mahomes was able to take advantage of that all game. And that's the reason why, that was the reason why I didn't believe in them week 4. That was the reason I didn't believe in them all the way to the championship game.
Eagles. Let's look at their roster and the ways that it might change this offseason.
Yeah,
These are the pending free agents here on defense. On offense, we're pretty much looking at Mekhi Becton at right guard.
Right.
And then on defense, there are a handful of names. Zach Bond, Milton Williams. Milton Williams, who had himself a year and is going to get his aid, I'm guessing. Josh Sweat. By the way, Brandon Graham was in the Super Bowl 99th percentile in pass rush get off and 96th percentile in pass rush finish, which I thought was crazy considering that it was his first game back from the injuries.
He looked great, I gotta say. Now, they were getting after them, and everyone was getting after them, so maybe his job was a little eased up, but
true.
He looked great. Especially, it seems like he's going to retire, I guess. I don't know exactly what he's going to end up doing, but
not a bad way to go out.
Right, certainly not.
What do you think that the Eagles, what do they do with that? Those guys that they're losing.
I think a team that is not as progressive as they are, just re-signs Becton and Bond, no questions asked. But I really question if that's the right way to do it here.
For Bond, because of what you said?
Well, it's just the linebacker position is a very transient position, number one, very difficult to predict. And number two, how much value are you going to get out of him? You feel good about Nakobe Dean coming back. Can you spin it back up via the draft? Or, do you just tag him? That seems like Zach Bond is a player that the tag was generated from. This reminds me a lot about the Devondre Campbell situation from years ago, where it's okay, this dude all of a sudden just became a S-tier player in this league. What do we take away from that, especially when we are uniquely positioned to just draft whoever we like at any given slot and then trade back a million times and add more draft assets? But I think those two decisions are very key in what they're going to do at the safety position. I think they're probably pretty set. at every other position, which is certainly something.
What are our thoughts about Milton Williams and what he's likely to demand this offseason? He had, in terms of our AI grades, he popped all year long. Like, I mean, you could pull up, the Eagles roster, and in a lot of ways, he would probably be a guy that would draw your eye in terms of our tracking data metrics as one of their best players this season.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because they have guys behind him, and they have Jordan Davis, who's still under contract. And you look at Mauro Jomo as well, who plays a very similar position because Jalen Carter just stays out on the field the entirety of the time. And he also was excellent in the AI grade. So it is interesting that they're in a unique position where these three players, Milton, Zach Bond, and Mekhi Becton, who had excellent years, two of which had like comeback sort of years, are in a position to be pretty, I wouldn't say easily replaced, but are in a position where the team may just try to replace them.
And has also exhibited an ability to do that really effectively. To find, like, we talk about the Rams, I think, a lot in that way, particularly on offense, and how they identified Puka and some of the things that they're looking for specifically, I think, are the way I describe it, or how it's been described to me, is that they're much more efficient in terms of looking for someone who checks the boxes that they need to be good in the ways that they will use that player for, right? Like, you don't have to be the best at everything. It feels like an old school scouting thing would be like, okay, which one is the best wide receiver? Okay, which one's the next best wide receiver? Okay, which one's the next best? And you're just going down the list, but they're also different and they do different things and they're special in different ways. So if you say, how are we going to use this person in our offense? What do they need to be good at in order to be used in this way for our offense? We'll find somebody who does these three things really, really well. They don't have to be good at these other things, right? Like, ideally, you want somebody who's the best at all of the things, but that's not where you find value in the draft. You can go find somebody who just does the specific things that you're going to ask them to do really, really well. And the Rams are a perfect example for that, I think, in terms of a lot of their pieces, but I think that the Eagles are too. And some of the ways that you've described some of the defensive pieces here kind of point to an ability to identify exactly the right person just to maximize that person within their scheme. So, they'll probably not face a lot of challenges based on the way that their roster looks right now in terms of the holes that are being created and the assets that they have this offseason to fill those holes. What about the Chiefs? We talked about I mean, they just need an upgrade at the tackle position, but they don't have any that are, going to free agency. You mentioned Trey Smith. They also have unrestricted free agents at wide receiver and running back. We've got D-Hop, who's an unrestricted, Juju, Hollywood Brown, Justin Watson. And then at running back, we've got Kareem Hunt and Samaje Perine. So they have Pacheco back, but then they don't have those other guys. That feels like an easier position. I mean, there's some questions we might need to ask ourselves about Pacheco and how he was used down the stretch coming off injury. But I think you could probably also say, like, maybe coming off of injury, give him some time, and maybe he's fine to plug back in next year. But at the wide receiver position, that's a lot of loss.
Yeah, I think you have to churn that wide receiver group, which they haven't really done in a couple years. Obviously, they've tried to bring in guys like DeAndre Hopkins. They've drafted Xavier Worthy. They tried to bring in Hollywood Brown, who was hurt for most of the year. But it seems like you have to start fresh at that position now, because you haven't been able to do it for years now. Now, Xavier Worthy did look good for down the stretch, and maybe you try to add a tight end as well to like backstop Kelsey. I thought Noah Gray was okay, but like, it feels like Kelsey is a year or two and he's retiring. So the pass catching positions seem like it needs a little love. Luckily, this is a draft where it seems like some of the second or third round pass catchers will be good guys.
Look at like what type. Let's do the whole like Rams approach here. Rashee Rice, Xavier Worthy.
Man, I keep forgetting about Rashee Rice.
I know.
They're just bringing him back.
I do too, because we didn't have him, but I mean, that is
it's
a massive upgrade when you get Rashee Rice back. So you've got Rashee Rice, you've got Xavier Worthy. What type of wide receiver are we looking to plug in there to complement them?
I mean, there was a lot of short game stuff with Rushy Rice, and they tried to make Xavier Worthy into the deep ball guy, just like blow the top off the defense, and it didn't work exactly. But I mean, he ended up making some plays in the Super Bowl, and also it seems like he improved over the course of the year. Maybe you get a second year bump, much like we've seen kind of Zay Flowers take, for example, in recent years. Maybe that's what you're hoping for from him. But it just feels like they need what Hopkins ended up being, which was like the red zone contested catch guy times 20. And that's what they just don't really have now. And frankly, like they've never really had that guy other than Kelsey throughout Mahomes' career. Like it's always been Tyreek Hill and Kelsey, or, no one and Kelsey. And it seems like that's the kind of guy that they need right now.
Is that a after the first round type thing? Like if I am plugging in a tackle for them at 31,
right,
and then your next pick's 63, 66, your next couple of picks, you think that that's a range where they can get a wide receiver like that, or is that not the priority even there?
Yeah, it feels like you could get someone like Jaden Higgins out of Iowa State there, who is a contested catch guy, shows up like that in our metrics looking over the season, also showed up doing that at the Senior Bowl. I feel like a player kind of like that who is kind of a Big 12 or smaller conference standout that you can like put in as a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4, and develop over the course of a year feels right to me.
We're talking about the offseason and some of the different pieces that these teams are going to need to swap out, and the Rams have already come up. Looks like they're going to be looking for somebody to replace Cooper Kupp. This is going to be a fascinating offseason as far as they're concerned in a bunch of different ways, right? Because not only are you going to move Cooper Kupp, what does that look like? What do you get in return for him? But then also, how do you replace Cooper Kupp through the draft, through free agency? What does that look like? Is Stafford back? Like, what are we even looking at? But in terms of Cooper Kupp, we talked about this a lot last week when we were in New Orleans, but we haven't talked about it here on the pod. What do you think is behind their decision to move on from Cooper Kupp?
So this is a place where the eyes match the analytics. He has just taken a cliff since the middle of last year. And it seems to be related to his physical health. He got a major injury last year, then was able to come back like late, performed okay early on this season, was like a big target earner, was able to make a couple plays, and then again injury comes and he ends up being substantially lower even at the route running level before the ball is even thrown, both in our metrics and according to just the eye test. And so the question becomes, and I'm assuming this is what the question that they were asking themselves was like, can we move forward as an offense that's just relying on Cooper Kupp to have a contested catch or 2 per game, and then giving Puka like 35% of the target share and maybe like throwing some seam balls to the tight ends here or there? And they made the decision that that's not the way they want to move forward. And so it seems like they're going to get late round draft compensation for Cooper Kupp, and maybe they're going to try to attack this draft or free agency for a wide receiver.
Remind me who our comp is for Cooper Kupp again.
It would have been
Keenan Allen last year.
Keenan Allen, yeah, correct. Which is
So
like a fourth or a fifth, and then I
thought it
think
was a fourth.
Just due to injury, I think it would turn into a fifth or a sixth at that point, which is crazy for a player like Cooper Kupp.
Yeah. And I think also, I mean, like you said, the eye test kind of told us this at times this year. Obviously last year, the injury thing is creeping in. I think there will be some people who will be surprised that are observing things a little bit more casually, that will be surprised if they get a fifth in return for him, just because, like in fantasy, for instance, there were games toward the end of the season, like he finished miserably, put up like single digit points in like 3 straight games, I think, to end the season. But prior to that, he'd put up like 20 plus points in back-to-back games. So I think that there are people who will casually approach this situation and go, but he can get it done, and will think that the reason his production fell off was just because they were prioritizing Puka. Like Puka was getting the targets, and so therefore the volume stats for Cooper Kupp just weren't what they once were. But they could have been if they decided to like come in with a different game plan. I think what you said there with regards to the story that our tracking metrics tell is the story here.
Right.
that people need to wrap their brain around. You mentioned the route running metric. Here are his ranks from 2020 till now: 10, 3, 1, 15, 79. That is a massive drop off. And you could
Definitely.
say, okay, injury, 1 year. So then go back to our all-in-one metric that you were pointing out, how it started last year. You could start to see some drop off in some of these different things. Our all-in-one metric ranks since 2020, 33, 2, 18, 57, 56. So now we have 2 years where we're kind of living in that same range. And that, to me, more so than the route running, which clearly falls off a cliff, but maybe that's an anomaly. Maybe that's a 1 year type thing. The 2 years of that all-in-one score kind of indicate that maybe there's a pattern that's being developed, and this is where we live now. And so I think it's a really interesting move that the Rams are making. And I'm not surprised that they're the team that's making it either, for a lot of the reasons that I've already articulated with regards to how the Rams approach all of this stuff. But it'll be fascinating to me to see how they go about filling his void. Like what they're looking for in terms of the person that they bring in. Is that somebody in the draft who, again, does specific things well that complement Puka, that complement the rest of the offensive pieces? I'm just really interested to see who that piece is that they go get.
Yeah, it seems as if, given the youth on the defense side of the ball, like they could reload at all those positions, but like those are young guys that you want to see develop and played pretty well this year. I know their DBs weren't the most locked tight of all time, but they're drafting at like 26th. I see Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State at like consensus big board 23. That seems like a guy who is kind of in that mold of a bigger guy, wasn't necessarily the wide receiver one, maybe a little bit under the radar through his career, but could be a guy who could get involved in the blocking and the run game like Sean McVay likes, a bigger body who's going to go out there and make catches and run good routes. He seems like a guy that fits really well, but I don't know exactly where the Rams view their own needs at, just because they're such an interesting team with their ultra young defense and an offensive line that's like a little shaky, but was able to hold up for most of the season.
I also wonder too, what's going to happen with Stafford this offseason, because not that we want to read too much into what his wife is saying, but I don't know if you saw these comments on her podcast, but she was very critical. And so in a way that could just be tied to good friends with the Cups, feeling emotional, feeling defensive of them, what he's accomplished in LA, looking for more loyalty, all that kind of stuff. Or it could be just a general sense of standing with the team right now.
Right. I mean, I think it's just your guy leaves, but it seems like the right decision. Like it seems like one of those old Belichick moves that Belichick used to make, where it was like, oh yeah, this guy has done so much for you, blah, 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 but it's time for him to go. And Belichick was a little earlier than I guess Cup was per se.
Always.
Yeah. But that's what this move feels like. It feels like selling as high as one can on a player of this injury status.
What about Debo? Since we're talking wide receivers, what do we see there with regard to where he still is in terms of talent, and what we think might end up happening with him?
Yeah, what's fascinating about him is just like, what does he look like outside of the Kyle Shanahan sphere of influence? Like, don't get me wrong, the dude is still immaculate after the catch, but he struggled with drops this year. There was some locker room issues all year. He wasn't as good in terms of pass routes as he was in previous years. And it's just like, what is this kind of blended tailback getting carries, let's get the ball in his hands type guy look like? And I just don't know where that fits. Like, it seems like a team like the Panthers or maybe even the Jaguars could use him. I know the Jaguars have invested a lot at the wide receiver position, but now it seems like they have a quality wide receiver one in Brian Thomas Jr. The Panthers have no real answers other than that Adam Thielen is a good slot receiver. But at the same time, it's like, if you're going to go ahead and make a move for Debo and really do what is necessary to get him, you need him to be all around Debo, and it's just a question of injuries and other things all withstanding whether he can be that guy.
His yards after the catch plus minus in our metrics for the last 4 years, 1, 1, 1, 55. They were an interesting team this year, and I know we both say that there's always context that's needed for this. This is like what's being turned out, and it's player agnostic, and I think that that's the fascinating part about all of these tracking metrics that Sumer is has the ability to turn out, but also with everything, there are questions that you have to ask, right? Like, what in this environment might have led to this? Why is this way? Do you have any thoughts on why that particular metric would have plummeted in that manner?
I mean, I just don't know if he's a wide receiver one. Like when people focus on him, I don't think he's going to be that guy. I think he's probably a scheme guy when it comes down to it. Now, it just so happens that he's in the best possible scheme for him, where you have Kyle Juszczyk lining up and at the slot, and you have Christian McCaffrey in past years involved, and there's just so much to account for. But like I don't view him in the same ilk right now in terms of available quote unquote receivers as I do, T. Higgins, where T. Higgins seems like a guy who can just go out there and win matchups. I don't know if Debo is that guy who can just win matchups by himself without the aid of quality scheme. Now, there are so many play callers that are excellent at scheme right now, particularly that are taking new jobs that could bring Debo back to his former glory. And maybe this was just a unique year because the San Francisco 49ers offense fell apart at the seams, and he ended up being the focus for much of the year. But all that being said, I still view him as kind of like a gadget guy. And we've seen this with DJ Moore, for example, right? Like DJ Moore was excellent with Justin Fields, and this year it just wasn't the same. And so I think these guys are kind of, you have to get the ball in their hands early. Defenses can adjust to that pretty quickly.
Debo will be interesting because I think all the things that you said are true. He's so specific. It's such a specific usage that I think it limits the pool. And then, what does it cost? What does that cost? And he's also been so up and down in his
Right.
career. So, if you're talking about somebody who has consistently been performing in a certain way, but I don't think that he checks that box. He's that guy. He's like the NFL career version of the person that we talk about at Senior Bowl who has an outstanding play that pops, but then there's 3 straight reps after that where you're like, I don't know that he won those reps, and so I don't know what to make of all of this. But like the upside is massive, but it's inconsistent. And
Right.
so I don't know what to make of that if I'm a team trying to figure out how to value that.
And it rightfully should cost 1 or 2 like mid-round pick. Like it's going to cost several picks to get him.
Yeah.
Like, and when we start getting into mid-round picks, just because the way the draft curve works, like we start kind of underrating it because you are getting a known quantity rather than a toss-up. But like once we start talking about like 2 or 3 guys who at worst will be special teams contributors year one, like it starts to become a depth problem when you're trading away multiple mid-round picks.
Does Rodgers have a landing spot now that we know the Jets are unlikely to bring him back? I think my take here, I don't even know if it's hot, but this is how I feel. I think the way people were surprised last offseason that Bill Belichick of all people, like how did no one want to hire him? But I didn't think they would want to hire him. That's a separate conversation. That's how I feel about Aaron. I think that there are going to be people surprised if he is the guy that is left without a chair in the game of musical chairs, but I don't think it is surprising. And I think it's more likely than not.
With all the discussions about the Luka trade right now going on, and people are like, yeah, maybe it's not the best. Like, obviously, as a team builder, you have to do what you think is right, but like maybe not the best idea to do it when people are protesting outside of the stadium. It's the flip side for the Aaron Rodgers decision, kind of to a certain degree. Like, they were like, Aaron Rodgers will part ways with the Jets, and everyone was like, the Jets, another victory in the win column for them. Like they hit the head coaching lottery and got the guy they wanted. They got the GM they wanted, who was well respected by the league. And, they're hiring analytics guys, and now Rodgers is moving on, and it seems like Garrett Wilson is going to be locked in, who seemed to be their best offensive player last year. And everyone's like, oh yes, thumbs up. That's typically a sign that time has passed on the window. And I guess if there's a place for him, it would have to be with one of these teams at the top of the draft that are trying to trade back, like the Titans or the Browns. But it doesn't seem like a great fit for either of those teams, other than
at all.
Yeah. Does Kevin Stefanski's kind of run and gun offense that we've seen with a ton of play action under center, is that going to be good for Aaron Rodgers in year 20 plus? Probably not. The Titans run a little bit more, shotgun RPO style offense that would cater more to the way that Rodgers likes to play.
Mm-hmm.
But the Jets had a bunch of good players, and the Titans do not have a bunch of good players, at least to our knowledge right now. So it just doesn't seem like there's a great spot. Maybe the Raiders, but that just doesn't. There's not a soft landing spot in any way, shape, or form, as there was with the Jets years ago.
All of these teams that you're talking about are teams that need a lot and are kind of trying to build, like culturally too, right? And look at the Lions and even the Vikings as perfect examples of how important that can be. Like if you're going to maximize the guys, there's a way to build so that you're building both at the same time. And I just think that if you take the football out of it, which you can't, and we can make that argument separately. But even if he was still playing at an average level, even if you were like, okay, all of these numbers, the advanced numbers, let's pretend like it had something to do with his environment and that they're not reflective of a drop off in his specific play, pretending that for a second, there's still so much that goes with him. There's still so much that we saw happen in New York where it was like, you got to wonder, how did those conversations go? They're bending over backwards to make moves that he wants them to make. Like the Devontae Adams, they were already done. They were toast. To me, it felt, and I know that, the outside world didn't agree. But at the time,
I got caught up in it after a while.
But it felt pretty apparent that when they traded for Devontae Adams, that this wasn't going to be enough. They were already so far in a hole. How much could a new wide receiver possibly pull him out of that when all of the numbers were pointing us to he's not playing well? So they're still making moves to try and try everything. I give the Jets so much credit because once they brought him in, they were committed to the bit. They were like, we're in this. Let's go all in on this. If it doesn't work, we're going to know we threw everything at this possible. And then at the end, we'll go, yep, that wasn't the right call. They didn't half-ass it with Aaron Rodgers. They went and got all of his guys. So there's that. And then he's polarizing, right? His personality. There's just watching the Netflix documentary, and then there are people who love him, and then there are going to be people who are like, ugh, that grates on me, So you're going to put that in a locker room that is rebuilding. You're going to put that in a locker room that in a perfect way, in a perfect world, you're trying to build a young team that can kind of gel together. And even if it's a bridge quarterback, it's a quarterback that fits in that environment and doesn't demand that things are a certain way, or make young wide receivers like the way he makes faces on the field, whether it's just a human flaw, and we all kind of have our own different things. But in a perfect world, if you're trying to bring up young wide receivers, you're not going like this every time they don't catch the ball, right? That's not ideal. So I look at all these teams at the top of the draft, and I'm like, you can't plug him in. Him of all people, you can't plug in for that reason alone. And then there's the actual football where, I have heard conversations. I went on a Jets podcast a couple of weeks ago and mentioned the fact that I thought that Aaron Rodgers wasn't good anymore. And the host was like, oh, now you've touched on something very polarizing in this community. And I was just like, really? Because I feel like most of the football conversations that I'm having now are not ones where people would point to passing yards. It's just that's kind of off my radar at this point. And it was a good reminder that for a lot of people, that's how conversations are being framed. Arguments are being framed. Well, he threw for a ton of yards. And so then you have to go, okay, by the way, the 8th most passing yards this year. But then you're like, okay, so this is a good conversation to have. If this is the way that you're looking at these things, you have to look at how many passing attempts. You have to look at like the script that made it possible to throw for that many times. So the second most passing attempts. He ranked 28th in yards per attempt. So he's throwing so much. And how many more times did he need to throw to get to the number of yards that was 8th most in the NFL if he ranked 28th in yards per attempt? Right? Like he's not even picking up that many yards. This is completely script related. He ranked 22nd in expected points added per dropback. His success rate was 25th. He had the 4th lowest pressure rate, but the 9th most sacks. Like none of this tells a story of a quarterback who still looks like the Hall of Fame quarterback that he was a few years ago. So I think it'll be very interesting to see if maybe even to some degree, Sam, there are going to be moves that are made this offseason that tell us how front offices operate and who is looking at the same numbers that we are and who's still telling themselves the same stories that we used to tell 10 years ago by like looking at things like passing yards or, eye scouting somebody. And so I think he'll be a really good example of that, but I have faith that it's going to go in a direction where people are surprised that the teams that are operating with all of these numbers trust these numbers.
Right. And there's all these mental exercises that one should do when evaluating these decisions. And it was really interesting. There's a piece, I cannot remember exactly who it was by, but it was about how Kwesi Adofo-Mensah at the Vikings approaches all these things as bets, which is like very rooted in the Brown system of like, I don't know what's going to happen. And like making that first step and saying, I don't know what's going to happen is very key. And so then you just try to make the best decision that you can make. And I think you look at, preseason win total, or you look at how many games across the season that you were favored in postseason. And when you're favored in the grand majority of your games and you're losing all those games, there has to be more questions asked. And it seems like if you swapped Jared Goff into that system, or you swapped Sam Darnold as he played last season into that system, they would just win more games. And when it came down to it, and then you dive deeper. Well, why is that? Well, they were seemingly running an antiquated system because that's what, number one, Rodgers wanted to run. And number two, Rodgers didn't want to get hit. So that's what they kind of had to run. And so it seems like in order to make him functional again, which the Jets clearly did not think that they were able to do, despite having, someone that people were really excited for Tanner Inkstrand coming from the Lions as an offensive coordinator, as a guy who was looked up as the next up in the Ben Johnson kind of tree of those innovative play callers. They looked at the situation and were like, we can't run what we want to run with this guy. And it's tough to believe that anyone else in the league thinks that they can do that.
Yeah. You mentioned Sam Darnold. Are we thinking tag and trade? Is that where we've landed?
It seems like that's going to be it seems like what the proper move should be.
Right.
And it's really interesting because JJ McCarthy has said some interesting comments about his injury and like, oh yeah, the Vikings did really well this year and we'll see how I fit into that. And just some weird stuff coming out. And maybe it's all, smoke and mirrors and reading too closely into the off season because, we're one day out and I already want more football. But my Knicks lost to the Celtics and I watched a little bit of Luka and I'm like, I wonder what JJ McCarthy's thinking right now. So anyway, but like, is he a known quantity? Question mark.
Yeah.
Did he play really well this year? Yeah, he did. Is MetLife cursed? Like, should he be a Jet next year or should he be a Raider next year? Who knows? But it seems like they need quarterbacks. And when there is a need, you do what it takes to, increase the price for that demand. And it seems like tagging and trading is what needs to happen. Now, what you would need from that is a second or a first round pick. which
Exactly.
seems like
Because
a little bit of a stretch because of the comp pick situation. And so, because he certainly will have to be paid. I mean, if I'm his agent and I'm taking less than like 60 to 80 million dollars guaranteed, you're in a sticky situation as an agent. Because like Baker Mayfield got that. Baker Mayfield was in a very similar situation. Baker Mayfield was on a practice squad at one point. So it's like the price is weird. The situation on the Vikings is weird. The last two games is strange.
that's
It's a
the thing.
very it's a
Yeah.
very unique situation. But also, if I'm the Jets, I need a quarterback, and I'm not positioned to get one right now. So that's kind of where the market stands.
I can't imagine him going back to New York, but maybe he will. Maybe. I mean, that just feels like such a weird thing to go back to the team where it didn't work out. But I do think that they're set up much better, right?
Right.
And so it could work out. And so if you are a new Jets regime and you're just looking at, you don't like the owner is the only one there that was a part of any of that backstory, right?
Right.
So maybe that is something that they should look at. I feel like the Raiders are kind of where I've landed just because I'm eliminating the Jets because of the weirdness, whether
Yeah.
that's right or wrong. The Raiders, I think, are the team that is the one that makes the most sense to me with Pete Carroll. And I think I'm higher on what the Raiders could do this offseason than most people are, just looking at where the holes are and how they could fill them and the assets that they have. And um, I could see them building out an offense that is borderline playoff team. I think that Pete Carroll professionalizes the whole
Right.
organization. And I think that plugging in a guy like Sam Darnold, you don't get where you're picking the Raiders. You're not going to get a quarterback that's your starter in the draft this year. You're just not gonna,
Seems like that's the case.
unless you draft one in like a mid round and that guy just hits,
Right.
right? But like
Which
you're
they've
not
already
starting the
tried.
season.
Yeah.
And by the way, then there's a whole story there about how oftentimes those guys in the mid rounds actually do hit at quarterback. Then I
Mhm.
think that that's largely tied to opportunity. And so if you have to bring in a bridge anyway, then that guy's probably not seeing the field in year one. And then is it kind of a moot point? But I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't try to do both to a degree, but with the first round pick, I don't see a quarterback there. And I think there are a lot of people that are looking at 6 and thinking that they should go get one. I don't think that there will be one there for them.
Right.
So
And I
think
think
that's
in
why I've
this
landed
new
on Darnold.
quarterback economy, right, where you have a guy like Baker Mayfield who's come back and Geno Smith is another guy. The two situations where Sam Darnold could succeed, the ones you would draw up is like new head coach, culture guy is just going to do what it takes to get a couple victories. That's the Raiders. And then the other one is like guy who has done it before. That's the Jets, like Tanner Instrad and the stuff they did with golf. So it's like the situations are ripe. It's just where is it going to go and what are the Vikings? How hard are the Vikings going to make it for teams?
Wouldn't that be
And do
wild
the
if it did go to the Jets and it was we swapped out Aaron Rodgers for Sam Darnold, and then if Sam Darnold is able to have success there? Because I think that the chances are
right,
greater that he does
right,
than Aaron Donald does. And they'll obviously make some moves, but like I mentioned with Aaron Rodgers with the pressure rate, like you had the fourth least the fourth lowest pressure rate. Like, we can't even blame it on the offensive line, right?
right,
Like, you're not under pressure that much. And maybe part of that is your ability to get the ball out so that it doesn't register as a pressure. Like, maybe there's some credit that he deserves for that being that way, but I, I don't know. And there's some pass catchers there for sure. Okay, so that's another one that we're keeping our eye on. I do think, and this is like way further down the list, but we keep talking about the fact that there are more quarterback needy teams than there are quarterbacks that can fill those needs. And a name that I think will be interesting to monitor in like a low key way is Joe Milton out of New England. Because I think that there's going to be a team that just needs to take a shot somehow. And that doesn't necessarily mean that he's brought in specifically to be a starter, but maybe if you're the Raiders and you're like, okay, we've got a bridge here, and then we go instead of getting someone in the draft, maybe we use a late pick to go get Joe Milton from the Patriots. And that's our dart throw as opposed to a third round draft pick. Thoughts on that?
It's an interesting situation because I think he did look good in the one game, but
In the
it's the
preseason.
same it's the same bet that you were going to make last year, and a lot of teams decided not to make that bet, which is like,
Yeah.
this is a physical beast who like maybe can play the quarterback position. Like, I don't know exactly what new information you would add to that bet per se. So it still feels like it'd be like late round compensation at best.
Yeah.
And it's still a dart throw, kind of like the Broncos were doing last year, where it was like, oh yeah, Jared Stidham's on our team, and now Zach Wilson's on our team, and we're also going to draft Bo Nix. Like, I think it would have to be as part of a strategy like that, certainly.
Okay. That doesn't feel like you're fully on board with my thought process here, which is 100% fine. That was like a nice way of saying like, yeah, I'm not seeing it, but that's cool. We have not talked about the biggest offseason piece maybe, and that's, the story that we talked about it a lot last week, but again, not on this podcast, and that's Myles Garrett. So he wants out. The Browns are suggesting, from a leverage standpoint, this is the smart play to say like, we're not going to, right? Just to hang on to whatever leverage you have so that you can get something in return, maximize that. I don't think that they have the goodwill to keep him. Like, I don't think that they have that built up, that credit bank of goodwill. I don't think that of all the teams that they can afford to keep somebody like Myles Garrett effectively against his will. I think it's the last thing that the Browns need right now. So I see them making this move. And we do have a comp for that. What's it look like?
It's going to take multiple first-round picks. It's going to have to be like the Khalil Mack trade from years ago, where there's picks and players and compensation all over the place, because you're talking about a guy who legitimately is probably the best, if not the second best non-quarterback in the league. Like, the discussion is maybe Justin Jefferson, maybe like one of the Eagles offensive tackles, and perhaps Jamar Chase, and then Myles Garrett seems better than all those guys, except for maybe Jefferson. Maybe, like, you're really dealing with a one-of-one Hall of Fame certified level player.
Yep.
And those players do not come available ever. Mm-hmm. And so if I'm the Browns, of course I'm saying that he's not getting out, because I really don't want to lose him. But at the same time, if there is a time to lose him, this is the time right now. You have the second pick. Yep. You can package it up with all kinds of other picks. You can build depth, even if you're not hitting on like top level players, and set yourself up to get a quarterback here in a year or two and rebuild. Once again, the Cleveland Browns have to rebuild.
I also think, and this is unpopular also, but that this kind of, I think that they're in a position where they're not going to be good for a few years unless they just randomly hit on a quarterback, because I don't think that this is the draft where if they take a quarterback at number 2, I don't think that anyone in the NFL, I mean, we talked to a lot of people for the last 2 weeks at Senior Bowl. You were at Shrine before that. At Super Bowl, we're having a lot of conversations with people. Nobody sees this class of quarterbacks as like, even though the top 2 have emerged as being in a different tier, nobody thinks that they are in the top 3 best players in this class. They are being discussed as guys that are going to go in the top 3 specifically because of desperation and need at the position. But I mean, you're going to see big boards come out where people like Dane Brugler and Daniel Jeremiah and different people are going to have them in their like top 50, but lower, right? Like, they're not going to be in the top 3 in terms of talents, which makes it feel like it's just a desperation play, which is exactly how I don't want to be drafting when I'm in the top 3. But obviously there's a reason that teams that are drafting there are desperate.
Right.
I feel like what this affords them the opportunity to do is maybe collect more assets, have more bites at the apple for future drafts. And also to maybe you take one of the ones that you get and you go get maybe you pick Abdul Carter at 2 if he's still there. And now you have a replacement, even 1 for 1, but then you've also picked up other things that can go with that. So not that Abdul Carter is going to be the next Myles Garrett, because like you said, they don't grow on trees, Myles Garrett's, but you have a replacement that is competent at that position, or at least that we're expecting to be. And then maybe you get yourself a bridge, and then you have an extra one and you can push the quarterback down the road to a better draft maybe next year. Now you have multiple ones and you can go get a better quarterback with that pick, because I just don't think that they're built to right now, again, unless barring like an improbable quarterback absolutely hitting, I don't think that you're set up to be competitive in the next couple of years. And so in that event, are you wasting the efforts that you're getting from Miles? Like, Miles is massive, but does it tilt you in terms of wins? Like, are you suddenly winning a ton of games because you have Miles? Like, that didn't happen this year,
Right.
and he played at the highest level. So if he goes somewhere else and you max his value, this could actually be the best thing in terms of roster building towards a more healthy roster, so that you are setting yourself up to succeed for a longer duration of time.
Yeah. And I think you take it back to those decision trees and those bets that we know that the Browns approach it like. If you have Myles Garrett, it's 95%. There's no sign that he's dropping off. It would be incredible and catastrophic if he dropped off due to something that was not injury related, that he will be one of the best players in the league. However, like, while that's great, you're probably not going to win a bunch of games as currently constructed. So you have to like go through all the other decisions that you can make. Okay, we trade him, we get multiple first round picks in the future years. Okay, so we probably have another first round pick this year. We take Abdul Carter. It's a 50% chance, maybe less, probably 30% chance that Abdul Carter is as productive, years 1 through 3 as Myles Garrett is, just given that would imply that he's a defensive player of the year candidate every single year. But on the flip side of that, we can pick up a wide receiver or a quarterback, and that's, like a 30 to 40% chance that they're actually really good as well, because we're going to be picking in this range and so forth and so on. And so you build all that out. If the left side, starting at we're going to trade him, ends up being more expected value over the next 3 years, you just have to go ahead and make that move, in my opinion, despite, all the facade of saying, no, he's a Brown for life, so forth and so on.
We've got lots of things to keep our eye on, and we're only we're a couple of days actually into the official off season. But I mean, all these things started coming out last week, Sam.
Right.
And we still have months to go from a free agency and draft standpoint. And we will have a lot more draft talk coming up on the Sumer Sports Draft Show on SiriusXM NFL Radio Friday night, 7 Eastern. It'll be me and Sam and Thomas Dimitroff, and we will be doing shows weekly there on Sirius. So that'll be fun, kind of tracking the draft. And then, of course, you've got your Draft FM podcast, which is dropping episodes pretty frequently. You had some really interesting conversations last week at Super Bowl.
Yeah, it was fun. We talked to the legendary agent Lee Steinberg about how he approaches some of these decisions, like the ones that Shedeur Sanders has made by not practicing. We're going to talk about that a little bit more on Friday and really analyze how the guys have dropped down the big boards if they didn't participate or if they were injured or something like that. And then this week we'll be coming back with more, and we'll be discussing the rising and fallers from the Senior Bowl, and a little bit more about, the underground of what people are actually doing to prepare for the draft.
Love it. So much good stuff on the way. I know you missed the games already. I am just thrilled that we're in off-season mode, because
it's the real
season.
Off-season. It's the real season.
I mean,
now.
they're just different, right? Like the football season is so fun in the ways in which the football season is fun. You're talking X's and O's and strategy and scheme and all that kind of stuff. And then the off-season is fun in totally different ways because of roster building and that kind of strategy that's attached to that. So I love this part of the year just as much as I love the actual season, and happy that we get to dive into that now. And Sumer Sports will be a great place for you to follow all of the moves this off season. Another podcast coming up next week, and again, join us on Sirius on Friday. Thanks for joining us now.